Raise hail, Commanders fans. June 1st, 2026 is going to be remembered as the day the NFC got flipped on its head, and the DMV is right in the eye of the storm. Myles Garrett, the defensive freak of nature, is headed to the Rams, making them the team to beat, and I'm going to break down exactly why this is a direct threat to Jayden Daniels in Week 9, and how Laremy Tunsil is our only hope to avoid getting steamrolled. But that ain't all, because A.J. Brown, the NFC East's perennial headache, is gone to the Patriots. This is a golden opportunity for the Commanders, but also a deadly trap if Adam Peters doesn't move fast, because the Eagles are circling Stephon Diggs, and I'm gonna tell you why we absolutely cannot let that happen. And to top it all off, I'm going to show you how Peters is building something real, unlike those sorry Giants, and why that puts us in prime position to dominate the division for years to come. Don't go anywhere, because this is crucial for the burgundy and gold future. I need y'all to process this carefully, because there are multiple layers in these two moves, and the instinctive reaction from most fans is not capturing the full picture. Let's break it down, piece by piece. First, the Garrett trade. The Cleveland Browns sent Myles Garrett to the Los Angeles Rams in exchange for Jared Verse and a first-round pick. I am going to be completely direct about what I think of this trade from Cleveland's perspective. It is one of the most questionable decisions a team has made in years. Myles Garrett is 29 years old. He is at the absolute peak of his career. He is probably the best defensive player in the NFL right now. Not the best edge rusher, the best defensive player, full stop. And the Browns moved him for a young edge rusher in Jared Verse, who has not yet proven he can be that kind of player, plus a first-round pick that is going to arrive in the range of 20 or later if the Rams are as good as everyone projects them to be with Garrett. That is not a rebuild, that is institutional panic dressed up as strategic decision-making, and Cleveland is going to carry that mistake for years. But that is Cleveland's problem. What I care about analyzing today is the real impact on the Washington Commanders, and there are two distinct angles that need separate attention. The first angle is the immediate one, and it is the one most fans are discussing. The Commanders face the Rams in Week 9 of the 2026 season. That means Jayden Daniels is going to have to stand across from Myles Garrett in his own stadium. And that, I will be honest, is a conversation that demands real respect when you analyze it tactically. Myles Garrett against an offensive line is a complete design problem for any coordinator. It is not just that he is fast and powerful, it is that he combines a first-step explosion off the line that ranks among the best in history at his position, with a variety of hand-fighting moves that make it impossible for tackles to prepare for a single attack pattern. Some edge rushers have one primary move that tackles eventually adjust to. Garrett has 4 or 5 moves he can chain in sequence, and tackles who try to anticipate the next move end up losing track of the first one. Now, who is going to be lined up across from Garrett for the Commanders in Week 9? The answer is Laremy Tunsil. And this is where the conversation gets genuinely interesting, because the history between these two players exists, and it is relevant. Tunsil is a 5-time Pro Bowl left tackle. That is not an honorary title. That is recognition accumulated by being consistently one of the best players at his position for half a decade. And Tunsil's track record against Garrett specifically tilts toward the tackle in most of their previous matchups. Tunsil has the athleticism, the reaction time, and the blocking IQ to give real battles to elite pass rushers. It is not a guaranteed win. Garrett is Garrett, but Tunsil is not an average tackle that Garrett is going to run through in 2 series. What concerns me more about the Week 9 matchup is not the one-on-one between Tunsil and Garrett. It is the distortion effect Garrett creates across the entire protection scheme. When you have a player of that caliber on one side of the line, the defensive coordinator starts manipulating stunts, blitzes from the opposite side, Garrett movements designed to create confusion in protection assignments. The right tackle has to help, the interior line has to communicate differently, and if the Rams coordinator uses Garrett as a decoy to free up pressure from another angle, suddenly the problem is not just Garrett. It is the entire system that Garrett makes possible. That is the scenario that Dan Quinn and the Commanders' defensive staff need to start planning for right now. Not in October, right now. Because Week 9 against the Rams with Garrett could be one of the hardest games Jayden Daniels faces in 2026. The second angle of the Garrett trade is the macro view, and this is the one I care most about from the perspective of the Commanders as a contending franchise. The Rams were already one of the most complete teams in the NFC before this trade. Sean McVay with Cooper Kupp when healthy, with Puka Nacua, with a solid backfield. Now you add Myles Garrett to that equation. The Rams went from being a serious NFC contender to being arguably the #1 Super Bowl favorite in the entire conference. And that changes the conversation about what the Commanders need to compete, not just in the division, but across the entire NFC. Now let's get to the second bomb of the day. A.J. Brown to the Patriots. The Eagles sent one of their best offensive players, a receiver who has been devastating in the NFC East for years, to New England in exchange for a 1st and a 5th round pick. And for the Commanders, that news is directly positive in a way that needs to be clearly articulated. A.J. Brown against the Commanders was not always a nightmare, but he was a player who in big games against Washington had the ability to change outcomes. With Brown on the field, the Eagles had a first-level threat in the passing game that forced Commanders' defensive coordinators to make difficult decisions. Do you spend an elite corner on Brown and leave Devonta Smith in more favorable situations? Do you use constant safety help toward Brown and leave the run game open? Brown created those dilemmas. Without Brown, the Eagles depend on a passing game that reorganizes completely. Devonta Smith is still a legitimate receiver, but going from having Smith and Brown to having only Smith as a proven first-level exterior threat fundamentally changes how defenses prepare for games against Philadelphia. The Commanders face the Eagles twice in 2026. Both times it will be without A.J. Brown. That matters. But here's the layer that nobody is discussing enough about the A.J. Brown trade. Why did the Eagles do it? The official answer is cap space reorganization and pick capital for the future. But the real question is whether the Eagles are sending a signal that their Super Bowl window with Jalen Hurts is narrower than it appeared, or whether they are making a calculated move to go get a different receiver with that capital. And the second option, going to get another receiver, leads us directly to the most urgent part of this analysis for the Commanders. Because if the Eagles have available pick capital and urgent need at the WR position after moving Brown, guess who is sitting in the market? Stefon Diggs. And if Philadelphia calls Diggs before Adam Peters does, Washington does not just lose the player they need, they lose him to a divisional rival who is now going to face them twice a year with that player on the field. This is the scenario Peters has to be processing today, not tomorrow, today. The Eagles in a normal year are already the hardest team in the NFC East. The Eagles with Jalen Hurts, Devonta Smith, and Stefon Diggs filling Brown's spot with his experience and route IQ are a team that is going to win the division if the Commanders do not move. The urgency of solving the WR2 problem in Washington was not just internal. Now it is competitive and divisional. My personal position on how the Commanders should process these 2 June 1st moves is this. The Garrett trade is a signal that the NFC got significantly harder, and the Commanders need a real playoff roster, not a hope and potential roster, to compete in that conference. The Brown trade is an immediate window of opportunity in the division that opens if Washington acts fast and closes if Peters waits too long. The good news is $43 million in cap space is enough to act. The question is whether Peters acts with the urgency the moment requires. Because June 1st of 2026 just raised the entry price for any team that wants to compete in the NFC. And the Commanders have the infrastructure to pay it. They just need to make the decision. And this is where the Diggs conversation takes a completely different dimension from yesterday, because the A.J. Brown trade changed the context fundamentally, and we have to analyze it from that new angle. Yesterday, the Diggs conversation was about whether Washington should or should not sign a 32-year-old veteran receiver with a history of locker room friction and post-ACL injury risk. It was an internal decision, a risk-benefit analysis the Commanders could take with relative calm. Today, that conversation changed, because the Eagles just created urgent need in their WR room by moving Brown, and they have the cap space and pick capital to go find an immediate solution in the market. Diggs is the most obvious solution available right now. And if Philadelphia signs him, the conversation for the Commanders stops being about whether Diggs was the right option. It becomes about why Peters waited while a divisional rival made the decision Washington should have made first. Let me put it in concrete terms. Diggs in Washington gives Jaden Daniels a reliable second option in the passing game and takes pressure off McLaurin. Diggs in Philadelphia gives Jalen Hurts an experienced, high-production replacement for Brown and keeps the Eagles as the scariest team in the NFC East. Those are two completely different consequences of the same move, and they depend entirely on who calls first. Now, do the Eagles have the profile to land Diggs? I will be honest. The history of Diggs on teams with established elite quarterbacks is complicated. The problem in Buffalo was not the system. It was the personality dynamic between Diggs and Josh Allen, and Jalen Hurts is not exactly known for tolerating players who put their personal brand above the collective. That is a potential friction point the Eagles have to evaluate. But we also have to acknowledge something. Diggs in New England was different. He worked within the system, led the team in receiving yards, and maintained the right attitude in a rebuilding environment where it would have been easy to disconnect. That can be a sign of real maturity. Or it can be that New England with Drake May was an environment where Diggs simply did not have the energy to create conflict because the team was not on the Super Bowl map anyway. I genuinely do not know. What I do know with certainty is this: if Peters is waiting for Ayuk to get released from San Francisco before acting, he is betting that the Eagles will not move in the meantime. And that is a bet I would not make. The Eagles are a team that moves with decisiveness when they identify a need. Howie Roseman has demonstrated multiple times that he does not wait when there are market opportunities. Peters needs to understand that inaction right now carries a real competitive cost. My position is direct. Peters should be calling Diggs before this week is over, not to guarantee him the roster, not to offer a 3-year contract. To have the conversation, evaluate where he is mentally and physically, and if the numbers make sense, close it. Because letting Diggs land in Philadelphia while the Commanders are sitting on $43 million in cap space would be one of the most avoidable strategic failures of this entire offseason. I want to close with something that is not a roster move or a trade rumor, but that I think is fundamental for understanding where the Commanders are going as a franchise versus where their rivals are going. The Giants signed Odell Beckham Jr., OBJ, the same OBJ who did not play in the NFL last season, the same OBJ who was suspended for using performance-enhancing drugs. The same OBJ who in his most recent stop with the Miami Dolphins in 2024 caught 9 passes for 55 receiving yards in 9 games, 9 catches, 55 yards in 9 games. And Joe Schoen, the Giants GM, made that decision because Malik Neighbors is not ready and he needed to generate anything so that the Jackson Dart and John Harbaugh project does not start completely empty in the receiver room. I am going to be direct about what I think of that decision. It is exactly the kind of move teams make when they are in panic mode disguised as optimism. Signing OBJ in 2026 is not building to win. It is signing a name that people recognize so fans do not go into complete meltdown before training camp starts. It is perception management, not roster management. And here is the point I think matters most when analyzing the contrast between Peters and what the Giants are doing. This is exactly the type of player the Commanders would have signed last year under the previous regime, when the philosophy was assembling recognizable veterans and hoping the magic would happen. That was the pre-Peters Commanders, the one that signed players for what they were, not for what they can be. Peters arrived and changed that philosophy deliberately and with documentation. The moves of this offseason have a clear pattern: youth, speed, and players with something to prove. Treylon Burks has something to prove. Antonio Williams has something to prove. Sonny Styles has something to prove. Odafe Oweh has something to prove in a new system. That is a coherent building philosophy, not a collage of nostalgia. And now Peters is hiring John Lynch's nephew as a scouting associate. That might sound like a footnote in today's news cycle, but I see it as another piece of that same pattern. Peters spent 7 years in San Francisco learning how the 49ers built one of the most effective scouting organizations in the league for a decade. Lynch as GM, Kyle Shanahan as head coach, and an evaluation department that consistently found players other teams undervalued. Peters is not just importing players from San Francisco. He is importing the methodology, the contacts, and the evaluation culture that made that franchise great. Keenan Guthrie is the 3rd recruit from the 49ers orbit that Peters has brought to the staff in months. Ryan Kesenick as director of college scouting. Now Guthrie. That is not coincidence. That is the systematic construction of a talent evaluation infrastructure that is going to pay dividends in the 2027, 2028, and 2029 drafts. Peters is playing the long game while the Giants are playing the short game, and the history of the NFL says consistently that the team playing the long game ends up winning. My final position on this contrast: Peters is not perfect. He still has work to do in the receiver room and the clock is ticking, but the philosophical direction of this franchise is correct. It is documented and it has an execution track record that backs it up. The Giants are going to start the 2026 season with OBJ, Juju, and Neighbors in doubt. The Commanders are going to start it with a younger, faster, more coherent roster built around a medium-term plan that actually makes sense. That difference, fam, is everything. That is everything I have got today. And listen, if this video left you with one clear image, let it be this, Chars. June 1st of 2026 changed the NFC permanently. Garrett is in Los Angeles, Brown is in New England, the NFC East opened up and got more complicated at the same time, and the Commanders are standing at that crossroads with $43 million in cap space, a smart GM, and the very real pressure that if they do not move fast in the receiver market, the Eagles are going to move for them. Peters has made the right calls this offseason. The next decision is the most urgent one he has faced. Raise hail. Always. Hit that like button if this analysis gave you something, subscribe if you have not done it yet, and tell me down in the comments. Does Peters call Diggs this week, or does he wait for Ayuk even if the Eagles move first? I want to read every single answer. See you in the next one.